My name's David Drummond. I'm one of the Alphabet/Google folks. And we're going to talk about a subject that's on many of our minds right now, especially right now. So while we've been at this conference, we've seen yet another videotape released of a black man being killed by the police under what can only be described as strange and hard to explain circumstances. And nothing in recent years has really roiled our moral consciousness in this country more than these killings of black people by the police and the public viewing of them through videotapes and so forth. And these killings have sparked a national conversation, a long overdue national conversation, and it goes beyond these issues of police misconduct, and it's forcing us to grapple really with the core issue of how much Black lives matter in this society, the core issues of are we going to be able to build a more unified and less divided society. I think it's safe to say that the Trump campaign in tone and in substance has only turbocharged this conversation. So we'd like to continue that conversation here. And I couldn't ask for to have two better people with whom to do it here on stage with us. Sherilyn Ifill and DeRay Mckesson. These are two real amazing leaders in the movement for social justice in this country. Sherilyn is the 7th president and director counsel of the legendary NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. If you don't know about the LDF, you should. Founded, of course, by the great Thurgood Marshall in 1940, and continues to do amazing work to make this a better country and a better world. DeRay Mckesson, leader in the Black Lives Matter movement, civil rights activist, agitator, candidate for mayor earlier this year in his hometown, a Twitter beast with a great many followers. He'll tell you how many. And of course, one of the most recognizable folks out there in the movement to deal with what's going on out there in our streets. So I want to start with DeRay. Now, so you're up in Minnesota, you're doing your thing, and obviously you decide to drop everything and get involved in this movement. Tell us about how it started, Black Lives Matter. What are the origins of it, and why you got involved?
Yes, I was sitting on my couch. It was August 16, 2014. I saw it on CNN and I saw it on Twitter. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was like, I'm just going to go. So I got in the car, drove 9 hours, ended up in Ferguson, and that was my story. Mike Brown got killed on August 9, 2014, and most people don't remember that Mike's body lay in the street for 4.5 hours. That's like half a workday. Mike just bled out on the street in St. Louis. And I was one of many people who stood in the street. We were in the street for over 300 days in St. Louis. Most people don't remember also. If any of you saw us on the news and we were marching, most people, they come and they're like, we marched in solidarity with the civil rights movement. It was illegal to stand still in August of 2014 and September of 2014 in St. Louis. We had to walk. And I was one of those people who was there in St. Louis and in Baltimore and cities across the country, making sure that these injustices weren't going to go unchallenged. And
Sherilyn, I want to get your overall perspective about this problem, and I want to frame it by going back to an amazing book that you wrote several years ago about lynchings and the horrible sort of lasting impact that lynchings have had on our society. And I read recently that more people were killed by police last year than were killed than in the worst year for lynchings in the Jim Crow South. First of all, is that true? I want to talk about the parallel there and what the impact that these killings, understand their different circumstances, but the impact that's having.
Well, first of all, thank you. It's hard to answer the first part of the question because we probably will never actually know how many lynchings happened.
Right.
Many of them were never reported,
right.
And so it would be hard to get that number. But I think the similarity is in the way it has really captured a sense of outrage and a really visual sense of something that's very wrong in this country. And, you know, the killing of Mike Brown, which in many ways really began to focus attention on this issue, really was focusing attention on something that had been hidden in plain sight. And, you know, the organization I lead, Thurgood Marshall, you know, if you've read the 2013 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Devil in the Grove, you read about Thurgood Marshall dealing with law enforcement in Florida who could kill black people with impunity. So this has been decades that we've been working on this issue. And the year before Mike Brown was killed, I actually thought this question about how the police engage unarmed African-American men was going to blow up, because we had filed a brief in a case involving a young man in Texas who had been driving home, drove to his house. Police followed him because he was driving a nice car, didn't believe it was his car, drove into his parents' driveway. His parents came out of the house and said, you know, that's my son. And I thought that, you know, so of course then what happened is he was shot by the police. He survived. But this young man, Robbie Tolan, I guess Alex Rodriguez is not still here. He was a Major League Baseball player. His father had been a Major League Baseball player. So I thought this is going to be the case where people are going to focus on this. I'm guessing most people in here have never heard of Robbie Tolan. So something different happened with Mike Brown. It had to do with the 4 hours in the street. It had to do with Twitter. It had to do with the ability to connect and communicate about it. I was on Saturday, and the pictures were there of him lying in the street. And so it allowed people to connect around an issue that people knew about and have known about, but have been separated in dealing with. And I think it's that connection through the videos and through social media that have helped kind of create a moment out of something that has already, you know, been happening.
Well, let's continue on that thread. So, you know, DeRay, you know, technology, Black Lives Matter started online, essentially, and sort of leveraged that presence, the digital presence, into presence on the streets. Talk a little bit about how, you know, the power of social media has led to the exposure of a lot of these incidents, but also organizing around it.
Yeah, so we know that we didn't discover injustice in August of 2014. We didn't invent resistance, but we did have different tools to talk about it. So in Missouri, in August, in the first days of the protest, there was a no-fly zone over St. Louis, which is why you never saw any aerial shot of the protest. Baltimore, most people saw what happened in Baltimore, and that was the first city that there was aerial footage, because in St. Louis there was not one. So if it were not for Twitter, Missouri would have convinced you that we just didn't exist. And Twitter was like our way of pushing back and saying, you know, one night, one of the chief of police, he was like, we threw rocks at the police. And we're like, if we had thrown rocks at the police, they'd have shot us on sight. Like, we didn't throw rocks at you. And we had footage, we had our own images and stuff being like, we didn't throw anything at you. So Twitter was powerful for the way we organize. You know, I think about people of color. We always face these issues of erasure, and erasure often manifests in two ways. One is that either the story is never told or is told by everybody but us. And in this moment, we became the unerased. We could literally just say, like, no, this didn't happen, this did happen. And the police didn't know what they were doing besides terrorizing us. So we could just organize on Twitter. We could say, like, meet here, and like sort of use codes and stuff like that to mobilize thousands of people in St. Louis and across the country to really press and confront people. And when I think about protests, it is this idea of telling the truth in public, that's what we did with our bodies, that's what we did with Twitter, which continues to be really powerful around the country.
You know, but we have yet to see what the full power of this is going to be. As a mobilizing tool, I think social media has been unbelievable. But from a legal standpoint, you know, from the standpoint of thinking about accountability, for example, of police officers who have killed unarmed African Americans, and thinking about some of the ways in which the legal system interacts in this, it has yet to be seen whether, in fact, having the video, because we had a video of police officers beating Rodney King. I mean, right. So it's not, this is the first time that we've been able to see it. Because I think underneath, we still have to mind the issue of the way in which race affects even what we see. Because, you know, we've got videos and people still disagree about what happened even when we have a video. I think the prosecution of the officer who killed the man in South Carolina, the man everyone sees, you know, Walter Scott, who's running and shot in the back by the police officer, Michael Slager, you know, that trial will not happen until next year. But, you know, I think most people think it's open and shut. I don't think it's open and shut, because I do think that what people bring into the jury room what judges bring with them onto the bench affects how they see what they see. Yeah. And very often they don't see what you and I see. And so I think the videos are so important because they have, as you said, kind of forced the question of you can't pretend that this is not happening, that something is not happening. But I'm still quite interested in whether it will then lead to what I think is vitally important and what police officers tell me privately is vitally important, which is this issue of accountability. That until people start being responsible, police officers start being held criminally responsible, and in some cases personally, civilly responsible, we're not going to see the kind of change we want to see. There's lots of other things that have to happen. There's training and data collection and all kinds of things. But a key piece of it is accountability. And I'm interested in seeing how the videos and the films are going to play into that process.
And it has helped us have these conversations in public in ways that we haven't before. So you think about Terrence, if any of you have seen the video, it came out yesterday in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A guy, his car breaks down. The police aren't even doing anything with him, but they stop. They kill him. He's unarmed. He wasn't lunging. He didn't do anything. And from the helicopter, there's a helicopter video. In the helicopter, the police are like, he's a bad guy. And you're like, you're in the helicopter. How do you know he's a bad guy? You literally are in the helicopter. And Twitter and social media has allowed us to bring those to immediate public conversation in ways that we couldn't. And there are a lot of myths out there. The police have killed 3 people every day this year. Black people are killed 3 times more than white people by the police. And these things had always been true, but until we could control the way that information got out there, they weren't public.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the data for a second. This is Google. We love data.
Yeah.
Saying in God we trust. All others bring data. So our eyes and ears, our common sense tells us, right, that there's something disproportionate going on here. What does the data say? I know there've been some debates about this recently.
Well, there are debates about it because there's no reliable data.
Yeah.
Right. So there is no real enforced data collection of police-involved shootings, killings, taserings, and so forth in a kind of a national database that we could all say, I can rely on that and you can rely on that because we both know that it's true. And so as a result, what we've seen newspapers like The Guardian and The Washington Post begin to develop their own data. I think it's an embarrassment that the federal government is not requiring this data collection. The president has kind of moved, his team on this, and we're seeing increasing data collection. But for us as lawyers, it's very hard to do without data. It's very hard. One of the great things in Ferguson, where they were collecting data based on race, disaggregated by race on stops, is it allowed us to see exactly what was happening with that Ferguson Police Department. Right. We could see that African Americans were 3 times more likely to be pulled over, even though whites were more likely to have contraband when they were pulled over, right? Because we had it. But we don't have that across the board. And so what we're left with are, when I was writing the book about lynching, what we call ghost stories. Yeah. Every place that I've ever litigated in this country, I ask about the history of discrimination, and Black people would tell me, what are in effect ghost stories, because they're not documented or written down about some pogrom that happened in their community. When I litigated in Tulsa, interestingly, in 1990, that's when I first learned about the Tulsa race riots. That was before that became kind of fully understood as part of our history. The same thing happened to me when I went to Maryland. I wasn't working on a case about violence, but I learned about these 2 lynchings that weren't written down anywhere. In fact, the local newspaper from that week was missing from the library. So there's no place you could actually document that these things happened. And that's what set me on the course of writing the book about those last 2 lynchings, to give to that community the truth that this did happen, and allow them to build a conversation about race based on the truth.
And like Sherilyn said about the data, if you get killed, all of you have probably experienced some data about policing, especially in the last few years. If you get killed in America and the newspaper does not write about it, you are literally not in the data set. And that is wild. So there's some places in Texas where the data looks like white people are being killed disproportionately, but we think what is happening is that the newspapers are coding Latinos as white, and we have no way, we don't know. And that is really hard from a data perspective. The other thing is we created the first public database and worked with the LDF on it, of police union contracts, and the police literally have a shadow justice system in America. So in Chicago, police officers' discipline records are destroyed after 5 years. In some cities, they're destroyed after 2 years. There are cities across the country where police can bring recording devices to their own interrogations in ways that private citizens don't have those protections. And when Freddie Gray got killed in Baltimore, the police legally could not be required to be interrogated for 10 days after they were charged. There's no private citizen in America who, like, when they commit a crime, they have a 10-day waiting period. And we've been trying to collect all this data to put it out in public so people can ask different questions and we can change the system.
So let's talk about some solutions, changing the system. So I'm guessing that virtually everybody walked into the room this morning, you knew something about Black Lives Matter. How many in the audience have heard of Campaign Zero? Okay, well, we got one over here. So that's saying something. So DeRay Campaign Zero, you've been the leader of that, and you have very specific proposals about how to police accountability, policing and tactics, et cetera. Why don't you talk a little bit about about it, and how do we get these policy solutions better known amongst folks out here who really want things to change?
Yeah, so Campaign Zero is this idea that we can live in a world where the police don't kill people. We can live in a world where there's zero deaths by police. And some of it, one big part of it is a police union contract project we did. Another part is around police use of force policy. So in cities across the country, it's actually not against policy to hogtie people, to chokehold them. Officers don't actually have to give a verbal warning before they shoot you, things like that. So we're trying to bring that into the public. And then some of the things that people have talked about, right? Like body cameras. We think that body cameras could be really powerful. We also think that they could be a tool of surveillance in so many communities in a way that actually isn't powerful. The White House is actually doing some interesting data to see if we can use the audio from body cameras to detect aggression in officers before there's actually trauma. So most body cameras, it's like after there's trauma, pull the video. Can we do something proactively? So Campaign Zero is really targeted on data and the concrete things that we can do. And we partner with people like the LDF and other partners in the space around the policing work.
So two things. One, and the Campaign Zero website is amazing and an incredible resource. And what we're doing is we're trying to develop language that can be in police union contracts that can actually transform some of the stuff that DeRay's talking about. Mike Brown was killed August 9th. I think it was August 14th. We wrote to then Attorney General Eric Holder and asked, could we have a meeting? And we had a very specific thing that we wanted to talk about, and it really comes out of the experience of the organization I lead. So, we're most famous for having litigated Brown versus Board of Education. The most, in my view, monumental Supreme Court decision of the 20th century, transformed American democracy, changed every room that you've probably ever been in, and I say that without exaggeration. However, it is also true that most of the great transformation that happened, particularly around segregation in this country, happened after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. People like me who grew up in New York, we were not bused to school until 1967, 1968, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has a clause in it that says that the federal government cannot give money to any program that engages in discrimination. So northern school districts now got afraid that they were going to lose money, and that's when busing and integration really started for that brief period that it existed in the North. What that means is that I understand the power of money. I understand the power of litigation, but I also know that money matters to transformation. Right. So the first thing that we did after Mike Brown was killed was that we began to research the federal dollars that go to police departments. And what we learned is that at a minimum, police departments all over the country, and there are 18,000 different police jurisdictions around the country, receive a minimum of $2 billion in federal funds. And our argument to the Attorney General was that those funds should not be deployed if those departments engage in discrimination, and to ensure that they don't, that money needs to be conditioned on certain kinds of activities that will allow us to feel confident that discrimination is not happening. And that includes anti-bias training, training in how to de-escalate encounters, training in how to deal with the mentally ill, training in how to deal with young people, data collection, body-worn cameras, and so forth. And we have been pressing that issue with the Department of Justice since Mike Brown was killed, and there's been some movement with new programs that the department has created to give funds to police departments. The Tulsa Police Department since 2010 has received $14 million in funds from the federal government. The Chicago Police Department $40 million in federal funds in the last 7 years, and we all know what's been happening in Chicago. So this is your money, this is my money, that we're giving to police departments. We have the right by law to ensure that they are using that money in a way that does not engage in discrimination. And so what we're trying to develop now on our website is an actual tracking feature, and we do need support for this, an actual tracking feature that would allow communities themselves to be able to track the money that their police department is getting, so that they can be advocates on this issue as well. We think that there can be legislation that can require this, that can strengthen this, but we need to really build that groundswell and support. We need to get people educated about this reality. And so that's one of the key issues that we're working on. And then the second piece is a little bit more legalistic. The truth is that police officers are not held accountable by law because the legal standard that is applied and was set by the Supreme Court and has been interpreted by the federal courts is a standard that allows police officers to pretty much say that they felt threatened or that they felt that this person could be a threat to someone else. Right. And it has essentially created a system of impunity.
Subjective, right.
Absolutely. It's supposed to be reasonable, right. But given the role that police officers play in our society and given the refusal of judges to actually include opportunities to talk about how race affects a police officer's sense of threat within the context of that litigation, we're just not able to see the kind of accountability that I think those of us who respect the rule of law expect. So we're working on that issue as well.
Great. So I want to talk a little bit about the reactions to Black Lives Matter, the movement, the push to deal with this issue, and what they say, what these reactions kind of say about the state of race in America. Right? We got folks saying, why are you focusing on this? More black people kill other black people than the police do. This hashtag, what is this all about? Black Lives Matter, don't other lives matter? All these different reactions. What do you think this says about where we are?
I'm going to go first because this is really, you need to just do this, but I'm going to give the historical context.
Okay. And feel free to include Trump in your answer.
One of the great things about leading a legacy old civil rights organization is that you have the benefit of history, right? So we have these incredible archives, and I'm, just a freak about our history, and I love it so much. Last night I was in Philadelphia helping to give the Liberty Medal to Congressman John Lewis, who, as you know, is a great civil rights hero. He was called last night a constitutional hero, which I really love. And what I think is important for people to remember is how John Lewis was regarded when he was a young man. Remember, this is a man who, engaged in lunch counter sit-ins when he was a student in Nashville, so he was 21 years old. He did freedom rides thereafter when he was 23 years old. He was at the March on Washington. He must have been 24 years old speaking. He was head of SNCC, right? I ran into Jess Braven, reporter for the Wall Street Journal, last night at the ceremony, and he sent to me the story that the Wall Street Journal did about the March on Washington. And in that story, they never mentioned Martin Luther King. They actually talked about John Lewis because he was considered the young, dangerous one, and nobody knew what he was going to say, and everybody was really nervous about it. So there's this way in which I think, we're kind of hardwired to be very nervous about the way in which young people engage issues of activism. And, I'm no longer a young person, but, we do feel a responsibility to protect young people. So we represent protesters. We have people that we still represent in Baton Rouge. And we also recognize the importance of the way in which young people's impatience has always moved civil rights forward. It was, Barbara Johns, a high school student who walked out of her segregated school in Virginia, who really pushed my organization, LDF, to file one of the Brown cases in Virginia because, she wanted to protest the deplorable conditions, and she led all of the other students in a walkout to the consternation of the black principal and the other leaders at the school. So this is a long-standing history of this kind of tension, and so it doesn't alarm me at all. It's interesting to me that is, maybe 10, 15 years ago, what I would hear is always people being concerned about young people. They're not engaged enough. They don't know their history. They're not activists. They need to pull their pants up. There was a whole litany of things that young people needed to do. And now young people are trying to find their voice for justice. They don't always get it right. DeRay and I don't even always agree on everything. But a young person trying to find their voice for justice, I'm never going to interrupt that, and I'm not going to publicly criticize that. I'm going to be here and available for advice, but I'm not going to publicly interrupt that kind of activity that young people are engaged in, because that really is the future of this country.
And some of the things that we I appreciate that context, and I agree with you. And Sherilyn's great. Some of the we hear a lot of things. So people talk about black on black crime, right? And what we say is that crime is not race based. That the crime happens in all communities. So we talk about community violence as opposed to affixing it to race. So like white on white crime, white people kill white people. Nobody calls it a label. When black people do things, it must automatically be deviant. One of the other things we hear is this idea of like all lives matter, which exhausts me. But what we say to people is like, if I go to a breast cancer rally, like people aren't yelling out colon cancer matters, right? They can like focus on one thing, and it is okay for people to focus on that. Which is real. People also talk, when we talk about white privilege, what I've heard some of the most well-meaning white people say is like, but I worked really hard, right? They're like, but I was poor and I worked hard and I earned all of the things that I did. And when we say to them is like, how hard did you work to make sure that every Band-Aid looked like your skin? And how hard did you work to make sure that every shade of nude looks like your skin? And how hard did you work to make sure that every baby doll looks like your kids? Like you didn't do that. That is what privilege looks like, right? That the world is, that like what normal means is you. That is what that's how white privilege functions. This is not an indicator of like how hard you did something or like how hard you didn't do something. This is about the context in which whiteness works. And like helping people understand that this is not a personal affront, but this is like a larger societal thing. And we think about things like literacy, Baltimore, 40% of adults cannot functionally read. That is because a legacy of black people weren't allowed to read. It wasn't like lazy black people in the country, right? Like, what does it mean when I'm a third generation reader? My great-grandmother could sign her name and she was incredibly proud, but she wasn't allowed to read. And we've been around the country talking to people and like they just don't, there's a disconnect with understanding the systemic way that injustice works. And people try and do this either, somebody was on the stage yesterday who said this like class not race thing, and race has an incredible impact in this country, that black people were targeted because they were black, not just because they were poor. So yes, there should be reparations. And when we think about reparations, that's like a lightning rod for people. But reparations at its root is this idea of acknowledge and repair, right? Like acknowledge that black people were lynched, acknowledge that black people literally were not taught to read, that the black family was intentionally destroyed, and figure out how to repair. And that the repair might actually look like an overinvestment in places that historically had been intentionally underinvested in. And when we think about like baby bonds or like some of these other things, people are like, DeRay, can't happen. And it's like, well, slavery was really imaginative, right? This idea that like white people were just automatically better and worth more took a real feat of imagination. That is like that's not true. This is imagination. And when we think about some of the solutions, it's interesting now that people are like, well, we can't do it. Like, we couldn't possibly make sure every kid can read. It's just too hard. And it's like, well, yeah, we constructed a system that literally said that black people were worth less. And that was like really intentional.
Can I say something very quickly just about investment? Because this is a big thing that we're kind of focused on. People say all the time, the government can't do anything right, that, these problems are too big. I think we should actually focus on the circumstances in which the government actually does get it right, because they do sometimes get it right? When the government decided that they wanted to create a middle class, a white middle class after World War II, that they wanted to have soldiers come home and be able to have a home for their families, that they wanted to support the creation of the suburbs. We got a GI Bill, we got the interstate highway system. We created all of these things to create the white middle class that many people who tell you that they struggled actually came from. So we can do things when we want to do things. And the investment, if you think about the billions of dollars that costs, the interstate highway system and the GI Bill alone. Right. And if we just imagine in 2016 dollars, if we wanted to truly invest in dealing with racial and socioeconomic inequality, we could do it. But we have to decide. We make investments. We made investments in the criminal justice system, which was our investment in race, poverty, mental health, all of that, and we put it into a prison system. We could decide today that we want to make a different kind of investment for the future that will yield something different, if we really want to. I think we can do it, and I hope that this moment is making people feel like we have to do it.
Okay, we have to wrap up, but I'm not letting you off the stage without a little commentary about the election and what the Trump campaign means for some of these issues that we're talking about.
So I run a nonpartisan organization.
Yes, sorry, didn't mean.
But it's really hard
Yeah.
because there's a conversation about race happening in this country that is happening in the context of an election, and much of it I cannot comment on because I run an organization whose tax-exempt status requires me not to engage in political campaigning. But I can say this, and I feel I must say this. This campaign has unleashed something that was below the surface, but I also think it's actually broadened something as well that's quite dangerous. And whatever the outcome of the election, it will not be easily placed back in a bottle. So the charge that we really are faced with is to confront how are we going to engage the issue of race post-Obama and post this particular election, post this Trump-Hillary Clinton election, in which we have shifted the ground in what we can talk about, in what we can say, in how we're able to characterize situations and people. I think this is a new normal that we are unprepared for. Remember people who thought we were post-racial, 8 years ago. It's so impossible to say that now, first and foremost because of all the videos that we've seen and that are part of now kind of our consciousness, but also because of what's been unleashed in this country. And so I think this is the time in which you have to be on board the project of dealing with equality and racism in this country. It's so now spilled over that it's not like just nice civil rights lawyers like myself and activists like DeRay are doing it. It really does have to be the job of every citizen to play some role in dealing with this issue before it spreads like a cancer.
And I'll say quickly, Hillary cannot win and cannot govern without black people. Trump can do both. And that worries me. I think that, in this election, Trump is, as you all know, he is a reality TV candidate. I think he plays a camera really well. I think I've been saying everybody here, I think his surrogates are so, even when the message is wild, they're just so on message. And you're like, I don't believe that, but you just delivered that line. And I worry with the Clinton campaign that sometimes they're just slow to respond to some things that shouldn't be that hard. So I think about pneumonia. When Bill came out afterwards and it's like she had the flu, it's like, but I thought she had pneumonia. And then they're like, don't listen to Bill. And you're like, people already question your sincerity. And those are like easy things that you could just figure out how to say, is she sick or not? And it's those sort of things that I think about younger people. And when we met with Hillary, I sat across from her and I said, Hillary, I worry that you don't get that people just aren't going to vote. I don't think black people are going to vote for Trump. I think they're just not going to vote. And I do think there are some people who believe that a Trump presidency is going to usher in like a sort of productive apocalypse, that like the system's going to come to a grinding halt, and then in the grind, sort of, freedom comes or something. And we have, as you know, the system's not going to come to a grinding halt. It didn't under some of the presidents that have done a lot of harm to people of color.
Black people are going to vote, though.
Yeah. I don't know if young black people will vote. I'm hopeful, though. I'm hopeful. But I think that there has to be more messages than shame. And I think that a lot of people are trying to do that. Like, if you don't vote, you don't care. If you don't vote, you don't really believe in the world. And I think about myself as somebody who got tear gassed in St. Louis and pepperballed and pepper sprayed in cities across the country. And I voted my entire life. And voting was not the one all be all. I'm going to vote. And I believe it as one tool of many.
Because of what? Because of voter suppression, because of history and so forth. It's not about the candidate.
Because I get that it's like one tool that that it is actually a way to protest as well, right? But I do think that I think about President Obama's speech at the CBC, right? And he said it'll be a personal affront to my legacy, and that shame-based way of influencing people, I don't think the research actually says shame is not a motivator. But it also just, we know it's not. And I worry that is a dominant message right now. If you don't vote, you don't care. And I think that is going to actually keep people home.
Well, fascinating. I wish we could continue. We will see, indeed. DeRay, Sherilyn, thank you so much.